So it's 2 minutes past 11. Let me start as people will be coming in. Good morning and welcome to our second Brussels Dialogue organized by the FAO Liaison Office in Brussels. My name is Mirto Arvaniti and I'm the Marketing and Communication Officer. I will be your host today. Today, our distinguished guests will discuss how we will sustain food security and resilience in Africa in
Rodrigo, I don't know, we have lost the sound now.
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to see what is happening.
Okay. So at least we all know it's not, there's always a doubt to know if it's an individual problem or not.
So really sorry. We have, I think I'm
now
back
you
now.
are
Really sorry, we have serious internet problems in Belgium, in Brussels, actually, the last days. So as I was saying, we want to keep the dialogues as interactive as possible. And given the high number of registrations we receive for this event, we have also set up the possibility for people to follow via streaming and on UN Web TV. The recording will be available on both FAO.org Brussels website and of course will be sent to you after the event. I know you're all looking forward to listening to our distinguished panelists as much as I do. So without further ado, let me run through the program for the next hour and a half. We will start with a welcome by the Director of the FAO Liaison Office in Brussels, Mr. Rodrigo de la Puerta. We will then proceed with brief interventions from a high-level guest. We're really honored to have with us today FAO Deputy Director-General, Mr. Laurent Thomas, who will open the high-level part of the morning. Her Excellency, Mrs. Josefa Sako, African Union Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture. His Excellency, Mr. Georges Chikoti, Secretary-General of the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States. We're also very pleased to welcome Mrs. Marietta Jaegar, Deputy Director-General of the European Commission's Directorate-General for International Cooperation and Development. And after our high-level speakers, we will hear some first reactions from the member of the European Parliament, Mark Tarabella. Mr. Tarabella is member of the Development Committee and of the European Parliamentary Alliance Against Hunger and Malnutrition. And then we will start with the second part of the morning. Our expert panelists are looking forward to answer your questions directly and interacting with you. We will have with us the Assistant Director General and Regional Representative for Africa, Mr. Abebe Haile-Gabriel, Mr. Maximo Torero Cuyen, FAO's Chief Economist and Assistant Director General for the Economic and Social Department, and Mr. Dominique Bourgeon, Director of Emergencies and Resilience. Unfortunately, you have seen on the agenda, Mr. Scholtes from UNIDO had to cancel his participation this morning due to unforeseen circumstances, but we have a replacement, a very good one. Mr. Dejen Tezera, Director, Agribusiness Development Department, will replace him on our panel. Before finishing today's dialogue, we try to do that at 12:30 sharp. Her Excellency, the Chair of the Committee of Ambassadors of the OACPS, Ms. Tenengba Jaite, will also give her special remarks. So let me start off by giving the floor to Rodrigo de la Puerta, Director of the Liaison Office in Brussels, for his welcome. Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mirto. Good morning, Excellencies, partners, and colleagues. It is a great pleasure to have so many of you. I hope in very good health in this second FAO Brussels Dialogue organized by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO Liaison Office in Brussels. Let me first of all thank our high-level speakers and panelists. I'm also very happy to see that the great interest of this specific FAO Brussels Dialogue with more than 410 and growing participants from the EU institutions, permanent representations, UN agencies, the private sector, and civil society. COVID-19, colleagues, will dramatically increase food insecurity and malnutrition in the world and in Africa. We don't have a crystal ball telling us the exact number, the exact figures in a year's time, but we are extremely worried because all estimates we have on the table are very negative. And my colleagues will tell you more about this. We also know that lockdown measures are disrupting trade and internal supply chains, are halting food production, and are making access to food more difficult. The effects of the pandemic will be very hard on the countries that are already facing humanitarian crises or exceptional emergencies, such as drought or the ongoing desert locust outbreak in Eastern Africa. But even worse, countries that were not in a food crisis situation are starting to be severely affected. I think it is more important than ever to work along the humanitarian development peace nexus, because if African farmers cannot buy now seeds and other inputs to plant, planting seasons will be missed and cultivation will drop significantly, thus bringing to less food available to both in urban and in rural areas. I think it's also key to ensure sustainable functioning of food systems and to invest in resilience for a more effective recovery and for the protection against future pandemics and future crises. At FAO, we're working together with the African Union, the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, our colleagues from the UN family, our national, regional, and international partners, and non-state actors, all of them present today, to better coordinate our collective response. Following a very high virtual meeting which FAO and the African Union held with more than 40 African ministers for agriculture mid-April, a task force on the impact of COVID-19 and on food security and nutrition in Africa was put in place. And the first meeting took place, was held already last week with the active participation of the European Union. You will hear more about this initiative from several speakers. And I just want to end by quoting our Director-General, Chi Dong-yu, with an alarming warning last week. And I quote, "We cannot wait until we finish dealing with the health impacts before we turn to food security. If we don't start implementing livelihood assistance now, we will face multiple food crises and a bill many times greater." I hope this webinar will be useful for all of you. I thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward for a fruitful debate. Thank you very much, and back to you, Mirto.
Thanks very much, Rodrigo. Let's now listen to FAO's Deputy Director General, Mr. Laurent Thomas. We're very happy we are here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to the colleagues in Brussels for organizing this most interesting dialogue. So, Excellencies, dear participants and colleagues, it's really a great pleasure for FAO to join today's debate. How can we sustain food security and resilience in Africa in times of COVID-19? The impact of COVID-19 on food security and nutrition is already profound and is going to be very profound in the coming months. Proactive measures will be paramount to mitigate the pandemic's impact on food and agriculture, but also to ensure that a possible and not unlikely global recession does not result in a rising numbers of food insecure. Let me set the scene and start with a few remarks on the impact of COVID-19 on food and agriculture in Africa based on the results and observations that FAO has made so far. Some food supplies are starting to be at risk in Africa as shortages of workers in the food chain, mostly due to mobility restrictions, affect the farming activities and the downstream trading, processing, storage, and transportation activities, but also leading to high post-harvest losses for perishables. Closures and restricted operations of markets across Africa lead to reduced access to diverse, healthy and nutritious food, loss of daily wages or livelihoods, as well as increasing food prices. Disruption to international logistic networks and restrictions in trade are impacting on food supply. Trade restrictions could be particularly damaging to African countries, especially countries relying heavily on food imports. FAO is particularly concerned about the pandemic's impact on vulnerable countries already grappling with hunger, hit by other crises. The point in case is a desert locust outbreak in the Horn of Africa, or insecurity in the Sahel or other countries of Africa like Somalia. Vulnerable groups include small-scale farmers who might be hindered from working on the land, accessing market to sell their products or buy seed or other essential inputs, or struggle due to high food prices, limited purchasing power, as well as millions of children who are already missing out on the school meals they have to come to rely upon. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in Africa, around 412 million people already suffer from hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition, impairing their body's ability to resist to COVID-19 infection. Of this population, more than 73 million people in 36 countries are already experiencing acute hunger, according to the Global Report on Food Crisis, a report, as you know, that was issued thanks to a very strong partnership of the European Union with SILS, FAO, IGAD, UNICEF, OCHA, USAID, WFP, and many other partners. In sub-Saharan Africa, 76% of the extreme poor work in agriculture. Over 20 million people are displaced on the continent as a result of civil unrest, climate change, drought, or conflict. In this context of added problem of COVID-19, collective action is needed more than ever. It is crucial for the food security and survival of millions that we ensure the vital functioning of the agricultural and food systems while protecting the most vulnerable. We should use this occasion to reinforce early warning systems and social protection mechanisms to strengthen resilience and to protect livelihoods in a long-term perspective. I think the importance of social safety net cannot be highlighted enough, as the pandemic could push millions of people, especially the youth in Africa, into poverty, particularly within the agri-food sector, formally or informally, which is exposed to social insecurity, loss of daily incomes, including from loss of remittances, and the already mentioned malnutrition. FAO's Memorandum of Understanding with UNIDO for joining forces in Africa is especially timely for this. FAO will continue to work closely with governments and partner organizations like the African Union, the Organization of the ACP States, and the European Union, but also our UN partners, to prevent a food crisis in Africa and to ensure that social safety nets meet the needs of the most vulnerable. I can assure you that FAO has established an appropriate corporate response mechanism that includes the entire spectrum from short-term humanitarian intervention to mid- and long-term development activities. We will focus on both prevention and crisis response measures. We'll support developing countries to anticipate and mitigate the pandemic's impact on food security and livelihood. And we'll make sure that there is also early identification of potential animal virus hosts and reduce spillover effects on humans. FAO's response aims to seek the active involvement of communities and partners at all levels in support of the Agenda 2030 and in line with FAO's hand-in-hand initiative. FAO believes that in order to respond to the global pandemic effectively, a multilateral approach is needed. In this regard, the organization welcomes the leadership of the African Union and the European Union's engagement in the FAO African Union Task Force on the impact of COVID-19 on food security in Africa. FAO also welcomes its strong partnership with the European Union and the Organization of ACP States and the European leadership in leading global efforts in driving global solidarity in the response to the crisis. Thank you, the European Union. Today's discussion is an important contribution to discuss how we can collectively ensure the vital functioning of agriculture and food systems while protecting the most vulnerable through reinforcement of early warning systems and social safety nets to strengthen resilience and protect livelihood. Thank you very much and looking forward to most interesting debates.
Thanks very much, Deputy Director General. We will hear in more detail later from our panelists how FAO is focusing on both prevention and response actions. Let me now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Josefa Sacco for her remarks. Excellency, we are honored you're here with us today and you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay. Good morning, every one of you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and all protocol duly observed. I would like to thank FAO for the invitation, for inviting me to be a panelist for the FAO Brussels Dialogue on sustaining food security and resilience in Africa in terms of COVID-19. I would like to place it on record that the Commission deeply sympathizes with families that have lost their loved ones as a result of these pandemics. As your excellencies may be aware, Africa's agriculture sector has been hit by 3 consecutive shocks in less than 3 years. The first is the fall armyworm in 2018, the desert locusts in the Horn of Africa in 2019, and now the COVID-19 in 2020. Africa's food system have been sitting on the knife edge for decades. It's very fragile, this sector. Before COVID-19 hits, 820 million people were already undernourished globally. Many of them in Africa, according to FAO. We just had the statistics that was shared with us by the previous speakers. We were already grappling and with conflicts in the Sahel and Horn of Africa, a locust outbreak in Eastern Africa, drought and flood extreme due to climate change, and increased food importation bill of more than 47 billion just last year, 2019. The 2019 edition of Africa Regional Overview of Food Security and Nutrition, jointly prepared by FAO, African Union and UNECA, indicates that 256 million Africa, or 20% of the population, are suffering from chronic undernutrition. 239 million of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. The impact of COVID on food system in Africa. Despite a late arrival in Africa, the coronavirus outbreak continued to worsen in many African countries. The COVID-19 health crisis has brought on an economic crisis. and it's rapidly exacerbating on ongoing food security and nutrition crisis. It is already contributing to increase food insecurity as a result of weakening currency due to the fall of commodity prices and rising of staple food in many parts of Africa. With 56.65% of the African continent's population in rural area and dependent on smallholder or family farming, who produce about 80% of African foods. The risk from the COVID pandemic to food supply chain, market access, and nutrition is very high. Anti-pandemic measures like nationwide lockdowns and border closures compound food shortage, while restriction on movement and quarantine measure impede crop calendar and farmers' access to the market. The World Food Programme has warned that an estimated 255 million people could face acute food insecurity by the end of 2020, up from 135 million people before this crisis. Which response is African Union doing to COVID-19? As your excellencies may be aware, the African Union is presently presenting a coordinated response to COVID-19 pandemic in Africa. In an effort to ensure that we do not move from a health crisis to a food crisis as a result of the worsening trend of the COVID-19, the African Union, represented by the Department of Rural Economy and Agriculture, known as DREA, in collaboration with FAO, hold a ministerial meeting on the 16th April 2020 to evaluate the implication of COVID-19 on food security and nutrition in Africa. All 55 African Union member states were represented at this meeting and came up with some far-reaching recommendations on the 5 areas that were discussed, namely the social protection, crop calendar, supporting the domestic market, boosting the intra-African trade, taking the advantages of the mechanism of newly created African Continental Free Trade Area, and 5th, safeguarding input supply chain for small-scale agriculture producers, poultry, livestock, and fishery. In a political declaration, the minister committed to supporting access to nutritious food for African most vulnerable, providing Africa with social safety nets, minimizing disruption to the safe movement and transport of essential people, the transport and marketing of food and services, and keeping border open on the continent for the food and agricultural trades. A task force was put in place to oversee the implementation of the action identified by the ministers in the declaration and reporting back progress to the minister on a quarterly basis. This task force is composed by the African Union Commission, which I'm co-sharing, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, is co-chaired by my sister Elena. I hope she's online and she can bring her own insights on these issues. And we have the European Union Commission, African Development Bank, the World Bank, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, the World Food Programme, and the EU Development Agency, AUDA NEPAD. The inaugural meeting of the task force was convened virtually on the 5th of May 2020 To agree on the terms of reference, the task force held its first meeting on the 20th of May 2020, this month, and adopted 4 proposed work streams as follows. The first work stream, to be co-led by African Union Commission and the European Commission, is to widely disseminate the political declaration and its key recommendation to the head of state and government, ministers of agriculture, ministers of finance, and other relevant ministers, RECs, and the international development community. The second work stream is alignment with the existing international, continental, and regional framework, including CADEP, the African Flagship Program, and other regional programs, the UN Secretary-General's agenda for the immediate COVID response, Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goal, and the African Union Agenda 2063. The co-leaders for this work team are AU-AUDA, NEPAD, and IFAD. The third work team stream is resource mobilization to support implementation of the recommendation in the political declaration, and its co-leads by the African Development Bank and the World Bank. And the fourth work stream is to provide coordinated and systematic support to new food security hotspots resulting from COVID-19, with particular focus on countries facing multiple stress, such as Eastern Africa with the infestation of the desert locust, fall armyworm, plus other plant and animal diseases. Co-leaders of this group stream are FAO and WFP. Members further agree on the shortening the reporting period to the minister for 2 months instead of it to be 3 months. A tripartite meeting with the ministers of finance, trade, and agriculture are the first reporting periods, and the need to think beyond COVID-19 and present some big ideas that could modernize African agriculture. These new ideas should include boosting the intra-regional trade using the Continental Free Trade Agreement, creation of green corridors, and supporting the informal sector. Those are all the aspects we're doing at the departmental level. So I thank you once again for your kind attention.
Thank you, Excellency, for giving us the African Union perspective on this very important issue. I would like to now invite His Excellency, the Secretary-General of the Organization of the African, Caribbean and Pacific States, Mr. Georges Ficotti, to take the floor. Excellency, we're eager to hear your short intervention.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this important meeting. Let me thank the Brussels liaison of the FAO and the Deputy Director-General of the FAO to convene us to this meeting. I think that the world is going through a very critical moment. The OECPS cover a very large region from the Caribbean to the Pacific and through Africa. Today, we are looking at sustaining food security and resilience in Africa in times of COVID-19. Indeed, COVID-19 has come at a time which is particularly critical for us. You will all remember that towards the end of last year, Bahamas went through a very heavy cyclone which destroyed most of its riches, probably up to 40% of its riches. As we got into the COVID-19 at the beginning, Vanuatu in the Pacific was also deeply affected by hurricanes, destroying most of their wealth. On the African continent, you will all know how much instability has affected a large part of the African continent that covers most of the Sahel region, which means it touches quite a number of our countries. But above all these aspects, we will all understand the weak health systems that our regions have. While that is indeed the reality with which we live on a day-to-day basis, we now look at how deep and strong the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our societies. Number one, it's that nobody expected that at any particular time we would have such a critical moment where everything would come to a lockdown. It then means that none of our countries were prepared that one day they will lock down, one day they will not go out of their homes, and one day they will not be able to either have their food, or at least those who produce it will be able to send it to the markets and supply those who need it most. So indeed, we are dealing with a problem which does not really mean a healthy problem of a day-to-day, but indeed the consequences of an impact such as this one, where we have people affected by the decisions we have taken as governments to confront the pandemic crisis issue. Then we will also look at the fact that most of our countries, not only they are not prepared for handling this aspect, is that there were no medications. Still, we do not have a vaccine, but we also do not have what we need in order to protect ourselves. That means you need a mask, you need gloves, and we don't have that. So indeed, our peoples are exposed to realities that are extremely complex, different, and also expensive. I do not believe that our societies will be able or ready to sustain life with such a difficult environment. And indeed, the crisis, when we look at it, has affected us more, not because we don't have basic food, but indeed because even when we produce it, we cannot take it to the markets, we cannot take it to the people who need it the most. And then when you look at our cities where you have an important part of the informal sector, you have more people who live on a day-to-day basis. That means they will buy something, they will sell that same day, and they have something to eat, or buy something to eat. And indeed, this also could not take place. And therefore, in some countries, we have seen that it was necessary, while we need to maintain the lockdown, we also need to develop food banks to be able to supply food to some people. In my country of origin, in Angola, the government had to set up food supply in order to give food to those who live on a day-to-day basis, who could not beg, who could not go out and get the food they needed. And indeed, when we look at the COVID-19 situation in Africa, I think that we have to be not only looking at how we can sustain that, but how some of the decisions we may take be practical, so that in a sense, we do not lose more people dying because of the decisions that we may take. So the dialogue today in some countries is, what do we do? People are saying, anyway, we are dying from the sickness, but probably also dying more from the consequences of the decisions that we have taken. So I believe that the impact of the COVID-19 on our societies is something that needs us to go deeper into understanding. Not only that we need to have strong and sustainable food supply chains, but we need to see how well this can work in a critical moment like the one we're living today. John Benny will also look at the fact that what has happened is a crisis that has affected all areas of life in our societies, because we were locking down. We do not know how long this lockdown is going to last. And right now, we do not know if we're going to have a second impact of the COVID-19, and I do not know if our societies are ready. And then the problem is, how do we react, or how are we going to be able to keep our people at home, and while they don't produce, and what are they going to eat? His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta of the Republic of Kenya, who is my president in office, has called for a summit with his peers for the 3rd of June in next week, so that they can discuss deeply on these issues. I want at this point to thank our cooperation with our European Union partners, which, when I look at it, has allowed us in the first few days of the crisis to be able to release under the inter-ACP cooperation $25 million euros, and in the recent days we are releasing another 189.5 million euros that we will send to most of our member states who most need supply. But the response of His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta is naturally to allow countries to think on how they can transcend the COVID-19 pandemic to build resilience and rebooting stronger economies. Because in fact, in our third world economies, one of the problems is that we are not prepared to sustain 1 week of lockdown or even 3 days of lockdown. You are immediately faced with the reality of our societies. That means that the people who have a job and are employed are generally the minority. We have come to understand that people depend either on a day-to-day informal work, or the peasant or the farmer in the countryside who produces some food and has an extra to supply or to sell to the market, to those who are in towns who do not produce it. So indeed, the challenge that is posed to our communities as we look at issues globally is to think, how well can we build sustainability in our economic models, that whenever we are faced with a crisis like this one, we know how to react. I think that no country, may it be developed, may it be underdeveloped, no one was able and aware of how it would react in such a critical moment like this one. So indeed, I think that while I believe it is important for us to look at structural measures and decisions we may take to build sustainability in terms of food production in our countries, I also believe that we need a global reaction that will make it that we can not only respond collectively well, but we are also ready to support ourselves. I now then appeal to the international community that this is probably indeed the time to respond to the needs of the countries that are weaker in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, on the African continent. I think we need to have measures that will be more appropriate in terms of contributing to our sustainability. I thank the opportunity that is today available to see that we can discuss this and look at all the risks that we have as we go, or we try to go beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. I believe that all our economies have been affected. We have not even been able to transfer money from important places. We have some of the countries, 43 African countries were under lockdown. And so indeed, what the world needs, and I believe that it will be important at the United Nations level as well, is to make sure that institutions like the Security Council can very well look at this. I think that this is a time when the world does not need to be divided. We need to come out as one and see how well we can propose solutions to fight the pandemic and eventually any critical moment that the world may face, like the one we are facing today of the pandemic of the COVID-19. So those are some of the comments I had as we begin this discussion, and I believe that as we go forward we may get into deeper, but I hope that the conclusion of this debate will indeed propose aspects related to food security and resilience in Africa, but I think we probably need beyond, and I thank the Commissioner from the African Union who has indeed presented the framework in which they are working. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency. We retain this message of solidarity and union that you mentioned at the end of your intervention. I'm now delighted to introduce one of FAO's most valuable partners in Africa and in the world. Mrs. Marietta Jaegar, Deputy Director-General at the European Commission, is with us today. Mrs. Jaegar, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, colleagues, FAO partners and friends, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of European Commission, I would first of all like to thank you for this invitation to participate in this important FAO dialogue, and also to congratulate Rodrigo and colleagues for organizing this timely, very timely event. In the last 3 months, we have seen how crucial it is to join forces for our individual and collective health, but also to tackle direct and indirect consequences of the pandemic. I would like in few words to explain what the European Commission is doing in addressing the COVID-19 challenges. And as you know, Commission has been closely following the implication and impacts of COVID-19 in developing countries, with a special focus on Africa, and especially in terms of food security and resilience. So we try to react quickly, and on 8th of April, the Commission adopted the communication, the EU Global Response to Fight the Pandemic, where this EU collective action puts focus on immediate needs to deal with pandemics, meaning from health to sanitation, water, but also food, as well as mitigation of social economic impact. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all EU member states for the Team Europe approach that combines resources not only from the EU, but from the member states and financial institutions to support our partners' needs. We also managed quickly to reorient 15.6 billion euros and orient them to the COVID-19 consequences. And I would also like to mention that our president hosted the Vaccine Summit pledging conference on the 4th of May to ensure the universal access to prevention, diagnosis and treatment. And also I need to mention that today the Commission adopted long-term budget and proposal for the recovery plan. So in this framework of the global response, the Commission is especially concerned about the impact of COVID-19 of food security and nutrition. As we are all aware, and it was mentioned before, that the COVID-19 risk having disastrous effect on food security, and especially on vulnerable people, especially children and women. When jobs and incomes are lost, you know very well, when the planting seasons are missed and the food prices rise, I mean, then we go into a very difficult situation. Therefore, our package from April that I just mentioned also supports small farmers to grow and people to buy food. And basically, we will step up our support to address the various food crises, and will continue to bridge the humanitarian development peace nexus in food crisis hotspots. I don't need to mention that the special emphasis will be paid on the Sahel and Horn of Africa. You also will agree with me that the good nutrition is critical to the immune system function, especially of children and women, and therefore to increasing resistance against the infectious diseases. So continued support to nutrition intervention is therefore part of the Commission response. But again, the COVID-19 showed that increased the risk of zoonotic diseases becoming a pandemic is there, and we should strengthen our One Health approach. This is my main message in addressing the threat and of it, and to step in the international cooperation. There is also a need to reflect on regulations and enforcement of the trade and in wildlife and wildlife meat for human consumption. And again, here, as many previous speakers, I would like to emphasize the need for multilateral approach. What we need is really more international cooperation. But in this respect, we highly appreciate FAO work on monitoring the global food security situation, and that allows us to react accordingly. And again, I encourage and thank FAO for this work, and we would like you to keep this work, good work in the future. We also appreciate FAO activeness along with the African Union, but many talked about that before. We are honored to be in the co-lead with the African Union on the one work stream, and in this effect, we will be really working close with our member states, with our private sector, in order to find the proper answers. But allow me to use this opportunity also to remind us that even before the COVID-19 pandemic started, global food security trends were not going into the right direction, as the last global report on food crisis showed. And I think that alarm bells are there. And we see that out of 135 million people living in food crisis situation, 56% live in Africa. So this is a major concern for all of us, humanitarian as also from the security angle. I would like to stress that, of course, COVID-19 comes on top of already fragile situation, but many of you mentioned all the disasters, and I'm not going to repeat that. So overall, when we address the food crisis, we work closely with the FAO, WFP, and many other actors in the global network against food crisis. And this global network, that was launched in the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, is also a coordination platform as a decision support mechanism to address food crisis with a humanitarian development peace nexus approach. And we would like to work with all of you to strengthen this aspect. Allow me to finish with a few words about the EU Farm to Fork strategy that was adopted by the Commission a week ago. This strategy, and I would really invite you to read it, calls for the paradigm shift by looking at food system as their entirety, meaning from farm to fork, embracing sustainable consumption and sustainable production. Of course, it makes a close link between the healthy people, healthy society, and healthy planet. And also strategy states that EU will support the global transition to sustainable agri-food systems. And in this respect, it also gives a homework also to us, to DG DEFCO, by indicating number of priority areas for international cooperation. And we are looking forward to work with the FAO and other partners to basically implement it. Allow me really to conclude by quoting the Commission's President who said that now it's time for humanity and solidarity, and you can always count on Europe to play the team. And it was a real pleasure and honor to speak to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Jaeger. I can also say that the FAO is also looking forward to working with you on the farm to fork strategy, of course. Ms. Jaeger has another commitment, but colleagues from the European Commission are online and can reply to any questions you would have for Ms. Jaeger. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have a special speaker for our event today. Mr. Mark Tarabella, member of the European Parliament and of the European Parliamentary Alliance Against Hunger and Malnutrition, will share his first reaction. Mr. Tarabella, we're looking forward to your contribution. I think you're muted.
It's okay. But thank you for inviting me, first of all, and I'm very honored to be here in this panel today. And speaking just after Mrs. Jaegar, it's very easy for me because I share the role that she spoke about, the role of a European Union, European institution. I'm a member of the European Parliament, especially involved in the Development Committee, but also in Agriculture Committee for 15 years. And of course, Farm to Fork strategy is an opportunity to change a little bit our way to consider agriculture, production, food production, and to change also the relation with other actors and other continents, as Africa, for example. And I think that my role is a few words here today to speak about and to highlight the importance of agricultural and rural development and livelihoods and also in the crisis before, of course, and moreover now with the COVID-19 response that we have to address. I think that we have to take into account to highlight the role of agriculture and rural development. For example, I read last week a paper from the WFP, the program, and highlighting the fact that before the COVID crisis, there were 130 million people suffering hugely and heavily of malnutrition and hunger. And probably with the COVID crisis, after the COVID crisis, this number will be the double. They spoke about 265 million people at least. And I think it's important to take into account this crisis, not only in the short term, but also in the medium and long term. I would like to highlight the importance of the collective response to safeguard food security, livelihood, but also jobs for young people, increasing in countries as South America, in particular in Africa. I think it's important to give the opportunity for them to develop economically around the food sector. And I think that the importance also of social safety, and Mr. Thomas spoke about that at the beginning. The social safety, also the safety nets and the access for health care is very important. A minimum of social standards is also a priority. And also for workers across the food value chain, because everywhere in the world, in the value chain, we have to act that the producers are the weakest one, and they need more protection to have a project of life in the food production sector. Also, I would like, and I close my remark here, to highlight the importance of the parliamentarians in the response to make sure it is a holistic and rights-based approach, and to assure a sufficient budget, including for a global response and the EU's partners country. I'm referring to the Parliamentary Alliance Against Hunger and Malnutrition, and the role of this alliance is also to work not only in the European Parliament, but it linked with, of course, the Commission, European Commission, Member States, but also you, all partners from Africa. FAO, it's a key actor when we speak about food and access to food. I think at the FAO, we have to work with you, and it's for that reason that of course, I accept to be involved, not only today, but before and after in this important issue that we have to resolve. Unacceptable that at the 21st century, we consider that 80, 100 million, maybe 1 billion after the crisis, people suffer of malnutrition in the world. The second goal of the 17 sustainable goal, the second is very important. Be sure that I continue to work with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're also looking forward to working with you. I now invite you to stay with us for the second part of our dialogue, the interactive discussion between our audience and our panelists. Abebe Haile-Gabriel, Maximo Torero, Dominique Bourgeon, and Eugène Tezera from UNIDO, thank you for joining us. I know you will be choosing questions from our audience directly, but I would like to ask with Abebe as FAO's regional representative in Africa. Here's a question for you. What do you think are the key challenges related to food security and nutrition that Africa is facing in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic? And what is FAO doing in particular on the field to tackle the effects of the pandemic?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well.
Thank you so much. Let me start by thanking the organizers of FAO Brussels Dialogue, my colleague Rodrigo and the team. Now, for the sake of brevity, we can look at the challenges from two interrelated dimensions. The first dimension is the exposure and vulnerability of Africa's economies and livelihood systems to various exogenous shocks. These shocks are, on the one hand, associated with heavy reliance on international trade, both for export and import, exporting commodities, food imports, and volatility of prices, and so on. And on top of this, there are other set of exogenous shocks which are really the disabling environment. In fact, these are overlapping waves of shocks. Maybe the better way of looking at it is as waves of shocks which are overlapping and having cumulative effects. Climate, it could be climate and weather induced, such as drought, floods, and so on, or transboundary pests and diseases, such as the desert locust or fall armyworm, which were mentioned already, and also proliferation of conflicts, among others. I think it is important to emphasize that COVID-19 is the latest addition, and this is one of the things that would put the situation in Africa quite different from other regions. The second dimension is the fact that vulnerable groups and systems are not adequately protected against these shocks. Vulnerable groups are significant in Africa, and other speakers have talked about it at length. Much of agriculture is rain-fed, which is seasonal and unpredictable. Reliable access of inputs, farm inputs, is not guaranteed to undertake timely agricultural operations. Risks of economic loss are quite high. Social protection and safety programs remain weak. As a result, there exist few mechanisms to mitigate the impacts. This dimension also makes the situation in Africa quite distinct from other regions. In a way, we're talking about a conundrum, and COVID-19 uniquely strikes at the center of this high vulnerability. Now, what is FAO's response? What have been FAO's response in the field to mitigate the impact? Very briefly, FAO's response in the field aims to support African countries to break the conundrum, which I talked about, of high vulnerability to the cumulative effects of or impacts of overlapping waves of shocks at the moment, most importantly, COVID-19 pandemic, specifically focusing on three areas. The first is enhancing advocacy at all levels. And this is to keep the food and agriculture supply chains alive. Initially, you will remember, all the focus has been exclusively directed on public health dimension. And governments have responded by introducing a series of restrictive measures through lockdowns. The concerted actions of FAO, together with other like-minded partners, have contributed towards exempting food supply chains from the lockdowns through defining these as essential services. Secondly, in terms of data and knowledge sharing, and this is to support evidence-based impact assessments, as well as policy formulation and implementation. FAO plays lead and key roles in providing technical assistance in the comprehensive socioeconomic assessment as part of the UN teams in the countries, as well as in sector-specific assessments in food and agriculture. The third is building partnerships and resource mobilization through engaging and collaborating with the African Union. Her Excellency Ambassador Joseph Aseko spoke about it. Regional economic communities with international financial institutions, bilateral and multilateral resource partners, including the European Union, among others. And some of these efforts are having promising results in several countries. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Abebe. Let me now turn to Maximo Torero, Chief Economist of FAO. Maximo, we had you on the same chair in our first dialogue some weeks ago to talk about food systems disruption. What are the latest updates about the situation of commodities, trade, and the food systems functioning in Africa, is our audience asking. Is there anything we can do to stabilize the situation? Do we have Maximo online? Maybe we can move to the next question we have received, which is for Mr. Dejene of UNIDO. UNIDO has been traditionally one of the strong partners for FAO in the agribusiness sector in rural areas in Africa. Mr. Dejene, could you give us your view on the challenges related to the COVID-19 for Africa's agricultural sector? What solutions in general could be proposed to the rural population, especially to the youth, to ensure sustainable recovery and employment in agribusiness in rural areas? We have Mr. Dejene from UNIDO.
Yes. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, probably. Good afternoon, Excellencies, panelists, and participants. Let me start by thanking FAO Brussels for organizing this dialogue, which in my opinion is very timely, and extending the invitation for us to be a panelist. Let me say that our managing director, Mr. Philip Scholtes, who was supposed to be representing UNIDO in this panel discussion, was unfortunately and unavoidably absent due to personal circumstances. And then he has asked me to replace him and pass his apologies to the organizers. There are, in my opinion, three key challenges faced by the agro-industries and agribusinesses in sub-Saharan Africa. These include the labor and supply shortages. As we all know, in sub-Saharan Africa, most of food production and processing is labor intensive, with informal and smallholder farmers making up to more than 60% of the population. Hence, restrictions on movement of people will lead to shortage of labor and shortage of raw materials, which will affect all the value chain actors in the region. The second one is restrictions on importers and exporters. As we all know, again, look for supply chain is disrupted, and we are mainly relying on food importers, but countries have also closed their borders. So food trade has been somehow disrupted. Farmers also cannot access market, and food industries cannot access raw materials. This will definitely is a big challenge for the food systems in general. The food markets in the local areas supplying the majority of food for Africans are also disrupted because of the city and nationwide lockdowns. And closing the markets has also disastrous impact, not only for the traders, but also for the public in general. In terms of small and medium industries, these small and medium industries in Africa contribute to about 80% of the industries or the small and medium enterprises in the region. These are both food and non-food, let's say, small and medium enterprises. The proximity of these small and medium enterprises to the local communities makes them definitely be well placed to shape and change their businesses according to the demand. The demand for food has increased drastically compared to the decrease in the demand of other, let's say, products or luxurious products. So hence, the SMEs can play a very important role in, let's say, building the resilience of the economies of the sub-Saharan countries. So we in UNIDO are working to alleviate this disproportionate burden of the SMEs are facing due to their size. Most of them have very small cash flow and they cannot survive more than a couple of months if the crisis continues. So in UNIDO, what we try to do at the moment as a response to this pandemic is to better understand the specific challenges of small and medium enterprises are faced with. So we work with them, with these small and medium enterprises, including small and medium enterprises, to mitigate the impact and help them survive the shock in a way that they can increase their resilience. The focus will be on collaborative solutions. So drawing on all key actors and building synergy in, let's say, understanding the local food systems. So UNIDO at the moment is partnering with our traditional partners in FAO on working the analysis of the impact of this pandemic on the agro-industries in sub-Saharan Africa. We are working with the regional office in Accra. And by understanding the critical situations in small and medium enterprises, then we can put forward a recommendation for policymakers, for development financial institutions, for international NGOs, and the small and medium industry associations. So we are also partnering with NEPAD AUDA, again, the same thing. They are developing a strategy for post-COVID-19, let's say, rehabilitation of the economy or the industries, and we are working with them, providing our, let's say, output of our studies to them to design appropriate policy and program to support these small and medium enterprises. With FAO, we are always working together. Now, at the moment, we are working on 18 projects globally, and then in 6 of them, we are trying to repurpose the activities of the project to mitigate the impact of COVID for these small and medium enterprises. We have also jointly, let's say, submitted project proposals for multi-partnership trust fund, about 6 of them. The most important other initiative jointly we're working with FAO is the opportunities for youth in Africa. As mentioned before, youth and women are, let's say, the most vulnerable people will be affected by this pandemic, by this crisis. So we are trying to focus on the youth employment and at least to the small and medium enterprises to retain the jobs for young people. So we are piloting this project in 6 sub-Saharan countries, which we launched the project in during August 2019 in the TICAD 7 in Yokohama. The other one is a partnership is on 3 ADI, what we call 3 ADI, that is Accelerated for Agriculture and Agro-Industry Development and Innovation. So we are trying to do business plans for the small and medium enterprises and other value chain actors to recover from this pandemic. So these business plans will be used for, let's say, financing the SMEs from different financial institutions, including development financial institutions. We have also working together with FAO on these 5 projects. So we are also working on other 6 or 7 projects recently to, again, in the context of mitigating the impact of COVID in sub-Saharan Africa with FAO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tezera. I see our Q&A box is quite explosive. We have a lot of questions. That's very good. Let me see if Maximo is back online. Maximo, are you there now? I see him there, but I cannot hear him. So maybe we should go to Dominique Bourgeon, Director of Emergencies and Resilience. Dominique, when a disaster strikes, agriculture suffers most. You are leading FAO's efforts in reducing the consequences of disasters and building resilience. What are the main challenges COVID-19 is posing to vulnerable communities already experiencing food crisis on the continent? Do we have Dominique Bourgeon online? Dominique? Okay, maybe then I will move to another question. I don't know if Abebe or Mr. Tejera, you would like to talk a little bit about that? Perhaps Abebe? What are the main challenges COVID-19 is posing to vulnerable communities already experiencing food crisis on the continent?
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, in my initial intervention, I wanted to emphasize the fact that the majority of the vulnerable groups do not have a sufficient protection against shocks such as the COVID-19, and so the shocks are overlapping, and there are waves of shocks. And that makes them extremely vulnerable. Now, earlier when Laurent Thomas spoke about the importance of social protection and social safety nets, this is the reason why we need to emphasize on that, protection of livelihoods of the vulnerable groups. If we use the examples of those countries where this is already a problem and where FAO together with other partners have been really supporting the efforts of countries to addressing those, then we really want to emphasize on building the resilience of those communities and the systems, the food and agriculture systems. Because this is like the new normalcy. We live with a series of crises. This time it is going to be the COVID-19, but like recurring, and therefore building resilience is the solution, and that is what we have been trying to emphasize, trying to focus our investments together with other partners. I don't know if Dominique has come, but I want to talk about, for example, the desert locust in East Africa, how these overlapping crises are impacting very serious interventions in the field. Initially, when governments introduced different kinds of lockdown measures, not just African governments, but also other regions, whether it's in Asia or Europe and so on, and when the logistics systems were impaired, it affected the operation of a very important activity directed at controlling and managing the desert locust in Eastern Africa. And so that's why I talked about advocacy as one of the important things that we do with governments and other partners to emphasize that these should be essential services. And soon we were able to get those activities as essential services, and the operations continued. So we have to look at it as crisis within crisis. And also it's important to understand that COVID-19 is going to be with us for a relatively long period of time. So while we are focusing on short-term measures, we should also keep an eye to medium and long-term responses. And that is what our knowledge and data sharing services that we are providing these services to member states emphasize. The policy tools and instruments emphasize on both the short-term measures as well as the medium and long-term responses. Over to you.
Thank you, Bebe. I understand that maybe Dominique is back online. Dominique, are you there now?
Yes, just back. I'm
it's
really
okay.
Sorry,
I understood you had. It's all right. You had some power problems even in beautiful Italy. These things happen. Okay, very good. So the question, Abebe very nicely was just replying. Well, it is a little bit, you are leading the FAO's effort on reducing the consequences of disasters. No, agriculture suffers most when a disaster really strikes. So the question is, what are the main challenges COVID-19 is posing to vulnerable communities already experiencing food crisis on the continent of Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mirta. It's really a pleasure to participate in this Brussels dialogue, and I'm very sorry that there was this unfortunate event of the power cut at my place. So the vulnerability of our systems. As a matter of fact, Ms. Jaegar and a couple of colleagues already referred to the global network against food crisis. And back at the WHS, the World Humanitarian Summit, indeed, FAO, the EU and WFP decided to establish this global network against food crisis, essentially for two reasons. First, it was indeed to get a better collective understanding, technically neutral understanding of the global situation in terms of acute hunger, the most extreme form of hunger, the one that can potentially, if not addressed, lead to famine. But it was also, I would think, one of the main reasons behind that was to do business differently, not only to work on the tip of the iceberg, on the people who are really on the cliff, but also to work on the root causes, to make this humanitarian development peace nexus a reality. On 21st of April this year, FAO, the WFP, the EU, ECHO, DEFCO, and in total 16 partners indeed launched the global report on food crisis, which is a key product of the global network, which indeed presented that the situation in terms of acute food insecurity remains critical. As a matter of fact, it presented that, as some people refer to, over 135 million people were in acute hunger previous in 2019. 27 million of them were actually in IPC phase 4, so really on the verge of famine. And the bulk of them, 73 million of them, indeed in Africa. So this was indeed a very serious situation in 2019, which was the situation we were faced prior to the COVID-19 and prior to even the Locust outbreak that started, upsurge that indeed started to take a very critical dimension in East Africa as of January this year. So now we have a situation where we have indeed the COVID situation that has hit, and where indeed the initial focus has been very much on the dimension of access to food. How can people continue to access food? But what we see in this context is that beyond access to food, there is also an issue more and more of food production, of availability of food. And when we see that, for example, in many contexts, the income of the farmer have been dropping, and that therefore, I mean, the share that is left for them to invest in agriculture is reducing, we see that we may indeed face an issue of access to food in the coming weeks and months. And it was very much highlighted in a number of meetings, including the one Commissioner Sacco referred to when the African Union, where there was a big focus indeed on the forthcoming planting season. What I want to say here is that basically what we see, and we need to understand the dynamics of what is behind the impact of COVID that is very diverse. This is why we are strengthening our analytical capacities corporately, but also zooming on these countries to indeed understand the impact and be able to be tailoring the best possible responses. And what we see emerging is that, yes, there is an impact on small-scale farmers, but there is also an impact on pastoralists. And pastoralists are often neglected. This is the main source of livelihood in many areas, especially in the dry lands, and these people need support. Through the Global Network Against Food Crisis, we have, I think, in the context of this crisis, and has been demonstrated also with the Locust, we have a golden opportunity not only to deepen our analysis, to generate, to work more towards joint analysis of the impact, of the diverse impact, and then to work towards collective evidence-based programming. This is absolutely critical moving forward, Mirto. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. Let me see if Maximo is also online. Since we're talking about food imports, we have a very interesting question. Is Maximo
Yes,
there?
I am back online. Can you hear me? Yes.
Very good. We can hear you now, Maximo. We have an interesting question from Philippe Barret from the Université Catholique de Louvain. So the question is the following, and I think you're the best place to reply to that. Is FAO monitoring the dependency of African countries on food import? And is this dependency increasing or decreasing? If it is an increase of self-sufficiency and protection from the world prices dumping at the agenda. Is there an increase of self-sufficiency and protection from the world prices dumping at the agenda?
Sure. No, thank you very much for the question. I think at this point, there is a significant improvement in terms of reduction of the level of imports, especially in North Africa, which is a net food importing of basic staples like wheat. But I think the important concept here is if we should go through the route of self-sufficiency or we should go through the route of increasing capacity and capacity to access to food. Our position is that we need to find ways in which countries will have to increase their efficiency and their productivity. But the most important part is that food is available to all through trade. And that's where we believe that not only global trade should be promoted, but also interregional trade. As Mrs. Sacco mentioned at the beginning, Africa has a huge potential for interregional trade. And that's where we need to try to take an advantage of the current situation. One of the things that we are doing as FAO is trying to assess ways in which we can support these activities. For example, one of the limitations that we have in Africa today is the presence of corridors of storage capacity, both cooling facilities and drying facilities. And these things will help enormously to assure and to be able to have a capacity to store food for smallholders and medium holders in Africa so that they can cope better with this crisis. At the same time, one of the major barriers for intra-regional trade is the presence of non-tariff barriers. So improving on food safety and improving on the standards on food safety is something extremely useful. Now, if we think on the global, on the world in global, what we know is that through trade, you can better allocate resources so that we don't exploit in an efficient way our natural resources. So in that sense, it's impossible to believe that a country will be able to produce everything that you need to have healthy diets. Healthy diets are characterized by diversity. And the only way we can achieve that is by having food flowing across the world and especially within the region. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maximo. We're receiving several questions linked to fisheries. We have one from Carmen Gonzalez from the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, as well as from, I will pronounce it really not well, I think Aucheria Amira Narimane of the University in Algeria. Maybe Abebe can start and you can complement Maximo. The impact of COVID-19 on fisheries in Africa, especially as food security and economies in several countries depend on the sector. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? The impact of COVID-19 on fisheries in Africa.
Yes,
I don't know if Abebe or Maximo.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, of course, Maximo can add. The fishery sector is one of the hardest hit due to the COVID-19, due to so many reasons. Most importantly, trade. When the restrictions hit trade routes and the supply chain was hampered, fisheries sector was, and remember, the capacities in Africa for preservation of food, including fisheries, is very, very low. So it can't be kept for long. And therefore, the loss is significant. But also the lockdowns in urban areas, the restaurants and you know, the fish markets were also affected, meaning the fish value chain actors have been at the receiving end of the negative impacts of the COVID-19. So yes, fisheries has been one of the subsectors that have been impacted, to be sure. Over to you.
Maximo, would you have anything to add to that?
Yes, only to add, fish, as in any high-value commodity which has to be transported fresh, has been affected by two things. First is labor intensive, so any lockdown didn't allow the industry to move properly. Second is perishable, and especially in the case of fish, that it was also affected on the demand side because of the close of restaurants, which create a significant reduction on demand side. But in the transportation part, a lot of the fish for export is transported through airlines, and those were completely stopped. And even today, that there is starting to be some mobility of airlines, the advantage of transporting these high-end, high-value commodities through air is because they share the cost between the passengers and the transportation cost. And today we don't have the passenger cost-sharing of the cost. As a result, transportation is extremely expensive for this type of products, and therefore it's not possible to move. So it's a sector that has been significantly affected, and still the effects continue to happen in this sector.
Thank you, Maximo. We receive a question on the topic of women. I can imagine perhaps Dominique and can start answering this question, and Dejene, maybe you can also give some insights about what UNIDO is doing to improve women leadership in Africa. And I also know that Leonard Mitzi from the European Commission is connected, so you can as well jump in at any moment. And the question is from a lady Agri, and it is, what is being done to put women at the heart of policy, actions and projects to improve the agriculture sector and food security in Africa? So what is being done to put women at the heart of policy, actions and projects to improve the agriculture sector and food security in Africa? Dominique, would you like to start, or Dejene?
Yes.
Let me start. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Please go ahead, Dejene.
Okay, I think women are both during this crisis are in the front, and then also on the front line and also at the back end. In the front line, because most of the medical workers, as you know, are women, and then are highly affected by the virus, and then also the difficult time to support their families at home. At the back end also, most of the African, let's say, the markets are run by women. these weekly markets or trans-village, let's say, marketing is done mostly by women. So these restrictions and has drastically impacted women. So what we try to do in UNIDO at the moment is try to find the real issues women are facing in this crisis, and our colleagues are working to understand where the problem lies. Mostly, if it is in the loss of the jobs or in the markets, and try to find an appropriate, let's say, helping mechanism to the woman. This is in addition to our work on women economic empowerment. We have programs in the MENA region in sub-Saharan Africa, trying to empower women through different kinds of skills development, so that they can be economically empowered and, let's say, survive this kind of shocks in the region. Thank you.
Yes, Mirto, I will complement also, saying that indeed, as was said, the women are, I would say, also very much at the center of our response. Indeed, the direct impact of COVID, for example, in terms of the role women have in providing additional care to sick family members, but also the containment measures that are being taken really pose new challenges to rural women in terms of their role as agricultural producers, farm managers, processors, traders, wage workers, and entrepreneurs. So it means that really what we have to do, what we are trying to do now, is really to develop solutions, especially also in our case in food crisis countries, to really provide the best possible support to these communities. For example, what we have been doing is to support smallholder women to maintain their income despite the situation we are facing with the COVID containment measures. In Senegal, for example, we have been linking women producers group with highly vulnerable women households. Basically, the groups are supplying what we call a panier de la ménagère, a household basket, to families with malnourished children under 5. The basket comprises a range of nutritious food, including cereal, meat, eggs, processed fish, and vegetable. And this is the type of activities that I would say maintain a degree of activity within the community, and that highly benefits the women. I think we have also to recognize, and this has been valid all over the world, that there has been also some increase in gender-based violence as a result of this crisis. And therefore, the work we are doing, for example, through the Dimitra clubs that are essentially a group of women that meet around issues of common interest, have included messages in terms of gender-based violence, but also messages in terms of social mobilization, social distancing, and that sort of activities. So yes, women definitely are particularly vulnerable in the current situation, and therefore deserve special attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. You may have noticed that many of the questions that you write in the chat box are already replied. That is because there is a group of experts, of FAO experts at the background, taking your questions and replying in written. So do not worry, any questions we cannot answer live, they will be answered in written. We have another question for Maximo from Martin Fowler, USAID in Uganda. And the question is, the pandemic has been underway for several months already in Africa, and yet the conversation does not appear to have moved on significantly. Are there any noticeable trends in updates on the shocks being experienced and the responses by the different countries, both in the public and private sector. Experiences from countries might be good lessons learned for all. Maximo?
Look, it's true that the situation has moved for a period of time, and the problem we are facing is we are not so sure, at least on our side, on the level of cases, given the low level of testing in Africa. There are countries, especially in Eastern Africa, which still have very low numbers in terms of COVID-19 positives. So, but we don't know if that is because of lack of appropriate testing and that the numbers could be different. Now, despite that, the process of lockdowns, of course, has created the shocks that have created in many other countries in the world. And that's where we're trying to react. We have been talking with private sector companies working in Africa, and the response up to now has been that they have seen a stable demand. They have not seen significant changes in the patterns of demand, and they are trying to continue their process of operation as they were before. Now, of course, these are cases of companies that we have been meeting. We cannot generalize from that. Now, the other problem that we have been looking very closely is, no matter what happens in Africa in terms of the intensity of COVID-19, there will be a significant reduction of the demand for what Africa exports to the world. Africa exports to countries like Netherlands, the UK, the US, China, and so on. A significant number of their exports, almost all of them, in what is fresh fruits and meats and so on, goes to those countries. And that demand, for sure, will be reduced because of the recession that we're going in. And that's our major concern right now. So there are two types of policies we are trying to work together with the African Union in this respect. One is to assure that at least the planting and the harvest happen this year, and we're working with crop calendars to be able to assure that despite the lockdowns, farmers can harvest or can plant. This is also linked to liquidity and how we can support farmers and SMEs and micro, small enterprises that work in the agro-food value chain to be able to have the liquidity to be able to do that, and especially to plan for the next season. And that's something that we need to work very closely to identify market-oriented mechanisms that will help to do that. The second thing is, if we are able to harvest, it's important to have the storage mechanisms, as I mentioned before, and we are working on the specific geographical optimal location of a specific green corridors of storage capacities in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa. Then, if they are able to plant, they need to be able to have access to the inputs. And that's another constraint that has been affected because of the lack of mobility or because of the logistical problems. And the second big component that we're looking at is, as I was mentioning before, intra-regional trade, because that could increase the demand between $20 to $80 billion, which could compensate the reduction of the demand because of the recession. Now, needing to say, it's also important to mention, as it was referred before, that COVID-19 is also affecting substantially and equally females and men. And the reason, one of the major reasons, is because of most of the value chain activities like packaging, peeling, and so on, that happens in many commodities are mostly done by females. And those are losing their jobs because of the closure of packaging processing plants, the closure of coffee peeling plantations in Ethiopia, for example, and so on. So that is where there is an imbalance also in terms of the gender, where we need to be careful, as Dominic and Abebe were saying, to try to compensate for those situations. Back to you.
Thank you, Maximo. I thank our panelists for this informative exchange. We really need to conclude now. We are 11 minutes past the time. In the last 1 or 2 minutes, I would like to invite Her Excellency Teneng Bajайте, Chair of the OACP's Committee of Ambassadors, to share in a very, very short time her special remarks. Excellency, I hope you are there. I hope you're unmuted, and the floor is yours for your very brief remarks.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you and see you very well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to start by thanking FAO for initiating this very important dialogue, which is also very, very timely. I have listened into the discussions, which were very lively and very insightful. And I would not attempt to dilute this with trying to repeat what our eminent speakers and panelists have said. But from the discussions, it is evident that COVID-19 necessitates the establishment of sustainable food security and resilience in Africa. Africa's food security systems are already fragile, which has already been elucidated by our eminent speakers. And COVID-19 is already exacerbating this. And this is why there is need for emergency interventions on the African continent. All the economies that we know of are already stretched, be they middle income or least income. And within those countries, the most vulnerable groups are already facing the impact of COVID-19 on their welfare, on their health, and their food security systems. And this is why interventions at the global level are very, very timely. And I do appreciate the efforts that FAO and other partners, including the EU, are already doing in this domain, because the national economies are already grappling with how to contain the world. And it is being said that the next nucleus of COVID-19 would be in Africa. So therefore, governments are grappling with putting in place mechanisms to ensure that there is limited spread of the disease. But in so doing, the very actions that are limiting the spread of the disease are actually having a negative impact on the welfare of our populations. And already populations are grumbling, and there's a lot of instability, muzzled instability in terms of asking people to stay home. Their welfare is being threatened. If COVID-19 doesn't kill them, then hunger would kill them. So this is the scenario that we are faced with, and I'm glad that the eminent panelists and high-level speakers have already dilated on the urgent actions that need to be put in place. Strengthening agricultural systems is a priority, because this is where the sustainability of food production lies. And already, Madam Chair, this is very weak in most of our African countries. The challenges that we face of poor soils, lack of proper drought, pests, etc. I also thank the effort being done by FAO in this area, partnering with Africa to deal, for example, with the desert locust infestation in the Eastern African region, as well as the intervention of other partners in this. But again, we need more partnership in these areas in looking at all the supply side constraints as far as agricultural productivity is concerned, which is already very weak. We're looking at job creation, especially for the youth and the women. Again, the participant from UNIDO elucidated on the issue of the impact on women, especially as small, medium enterprise holders who earn their daily living from the markets. Closure of the markets has a direct impact on livelihoods, which also has an impact on child welfare. We're looking at lack of proper food and nutrition, and the possible impact on children who are normally now being held at home. As schools close down, the food that normally children would have at school is now not available. So women have to work extra hard to make sure that they provide for their families, and we know the impact of that. If there's not enough food in the home front, children suffer a lot. And there's a danger that if we don't focus on this and target the most vulnerable part of our populations, we might go back to the days where we have, hunger, malnutrition, and the other diseases that come to play. I therefore thank our development partners for coming together to look at these problems and the threats that are facing our African continent and try to come up with strategies in a holistic manner to make sure that they assist our governments that are already stretched. As we speak, most of our governments are focusing and looking at their budgets, try to mop up liquidity from other sectors, equally important sectors, to address COVID responses. The sectors that are suffering are actually agriculture, education, etc., and other, health-related sectors. So we need to really look at that and see what sort of response mechanisms we can put in place. We are already aware that global ODA is bound to do it, because the global, the West is also suffering. Their economies are going to be heavily impacted with COVID. And looking at that, this is why intervention measures targeting the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable, are very, very important. I just want to assure you that the OACPS would continue to partner with FAO and other partners to look at intervention measures in this area. As stated by Secretary-General Chikoti, we have already started partnering with WHO. 25 million has already been earmarked under the intra-ACP program. And yesterday also we have had some support to provide an additional 100+ million to support our economies to deal with the pandemic in a more sustainable way, looking at the broader economy, not just focusing on the health sector, but agricultural systems, knowing that most of our economies are agrarian based on commodity exports. And we know that the market systems are very weak, both internal and external markets are very weak. So I therefore want to just register my appreciation to FAO, the process of the resolutions and conclusions that we draw from these would direct international as well as national policies in our response to fight the global pandemic and make sure that we build the resilience required. As Chikoti stated next week, the President in Office of the OACPS, His Excellency President Kenyatta, is going to chair a high-level summit of OACPS to look at the very issue of sustainability of our health systems as well as our economies post-COVID-19. And I think the resolutions and programs that we would come up with would actually help to complement whatever FAO and the European Union and other partners are doing in this area, so that our interventions would be holistic and global. We know that the response has always been, initially been, close your borders and look at your internal problems. But we know that COVID is much bigger than that. It's a global crisis. And for Africa, it's here and now. Already, food security is a challenge. Governments are having to come in and provide food for their populations, but it is not sustainable. And we're well aware of that. And we know that for a country like the Gambia, our hungry season is coming in October, in August, September. Well, already the most vulnerable are facing hunger, and the antecedent, the problems associated with that are already facing us now, here and now. I just want to emphasize that we appreciate the efforts that are being done, and rest assured that we will also do our bit in supporting those processes, and we'll continue to partner with the FAO in this endeavor. I thank you very much, Madam Chair, for inviting me to this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Before closing, I would like just to say that there will be a registration link of this event. The event also is live webcast on UN television, and there's going to be an archived link that we will share with all participants. The series of webinars of FAO Brussels will be continued, and in the coming weeks we will have some exciting topics and guests to share with you. So please do follow us on our Twitter account at FAO Brussels. Again, thanks very much to everybody. Thanks very much to our audience for their really nice questions and their interactivity, and hope to see you very soon. Have a very good day.
Thank you very much.